the critical Interdisciplinary Research Centre for Architecture. Ahora, en Europa, lo que se estudia en conversaciones totales. Su propósito de avanzar en la historia y la teoría de la arquitectura desde una perspectiva crítica. Queremos abrir un espacio que las complejidades de nuestro entorno dialogue con las nuevas la filosofía, la literatura, las artes, la política, y se encuentra atento a la relación entre los debates globales y las especificidades de nuestro contexto. El objetivo es ayudar a una cultura de investigación de historia interdisciplinaria y a la vez comprometida con la sociedad. Este proyecto no tiene por completo el compromiso de que se conforma el equipo de investigadores de Este, bueno, Santa María Carrera, en la magistral, en el Salvador, la Universidad y el Palacios. La universidad es un interés en la historia de la forma de los estudios de conferencia. Asimismo, contamos con el apoyo de un profesor compuesto por conocidos académicos y el apoyo de la arquitectura de la Universidad, desde el Conte de la Universidad Católica de Quito, desde el Quito de la Universidad Católica de Ecuador, desde el Este de la Universidad de Mark Jarzombek de la Universidad de Quito, Mark Jarzombek de la Universidad de Interdisciplinary de la Universidad de su generoso comportamiento se va a clave en el desarrollo. Quiero expresar el agradecimiento de los dedos de Canal Colegio de la Configuración, al equipo de Canal Colegio y las autoridades de la Universidad por su construida en espacio. Dirigido a la de la configuración al conferencia de desplazamientos. Llega un proyecto colectivo y educativo. Espero gracias al impulso de esta universidad no pudiera hacer. Antes de continuar, los objetos de nuestra participación será la conocimiento de una mujer humanitaria, donde compartimos con comprender una diversidad de close amount of discussion. In the case of the teacher the teacher corrector is given by Mark Jarzombek. Finally, the principle of the theory of architecture existed of the mind. And one of the most original and wide range of choices in architectural discourse today. To the question, the histories of the discipline and emergency of our contemporary about the way movement of architecture of our society and global perspective. All the elements of architecture go over with the purpose and value. Recognizing the modernity of architecture is of particular relevance to the human. It helps me realize the complexity of architecture in both human experience and scholarly vision. And that we can understand architecture and recognize historical and personal technology and truth. Making a direct observance of the practical operator in contemporary research. Its ability to represent architecture within larger cultural and intellectual constellations of an impression perspective, but how it is among events and essential human experiences. Later, our progress appears to become evident in recording data within the outcome of our useful research research as well as translations of art. His work is greatly reviewed in presentations with that speaker. In example, the privilege to measure the data with Corridic Modernity. His lecture was his journey and welcome Mark Jarzombek.
Excellent. All right, so thank you, Christian, for the introduction. I got to know Christian was there. I can't remember where'd you go? Somewhere. Oh, there, I could see you through the queue. Some 10 years ago, I think roughly, when he was defending his dissertation in Oslo, and it was very clear to me already then that he was going to leave his impact somewhere. We didn't know where yet that was going to be, but incredibly bright and energetic young scholar at the time, and I'm glad we were able to connect now today here at Quito. It's my first trip to Ecuador. Hopefully I will be back. The title is Corridic Modernity. Corridors are something that we know. They're ubiquitous in buildings. We don't really think of corridors as something that would have a history or that would provoke any kind of conversation about our sort of modern architecture or about modernity in general. But that's not true, as you will see. I want to show you two buildings today that formed the middle of the 19th century. So one is the Royal Exchange in London, and this is St. George's Hall in Liverpool. For the uninitiated, they look pretty similar. They are, they've got columns on the front, and they are sort of neoclassical in sort of style. St. George in particular, if you look into architectural history books, is seen as an example of the neoclassical style of the Victorian era in England. So these are not buildings associated with the modern world, with the world that you and I would be familiar with. Well, so let me look at the plans of these two buildings. There's a plan of, there are obviously different programs. This is a hall, this is an exchange building. So they'll be slightly different, of course, in their configurations. But the point is that the Royal Exchange building comes out of a way of planning buildings that had been developed in the previous century, where you have basically five buildings, in one box. It's sort of like you go to the grocery store and you get an apple, you get an orange, you get a banana, and you get some things and you put it in a bag, and you call the bag architecture. But when you look into the planning of it, you realize you've got actually 5 buildings. They're sort of just swooshed together around this courtyard. And so that's a little strange. And then if you ask, you got to go to the bathroom, you go to the bathroom is right there, right by the entrance portico. So you have the portico, you got your great columns, and there's a little window right there, and you can hear somebody pissing. So it's like really pretty casual in a way, right? You got the box, you got your frame, and then you fill it with stuff, right? And for a long time, in a called sort of Baroque architectural planning, was perfectly fine. St. George, which is built, more or less at the same time, has a very different plan as we can look at it, and it has in the plan, the original plan, this word, corridor. Now, I'm a bit of a literalist, so I was that's sort of interesting. Why would they label the corridor? Why would that be labeled as such, right? Because it might seem sort of pretty obvious. Now, this corridor functions to basically connect the building all the way through from front to back or from side to side, and it basically separates the rooms from one side from the main building parts in the center. So you put the main building blocks in the center, and then you have a corridor, and then you pack it, you onto both sides. And you can sort of see that the front colonnade there is basically just for show, right? It's called a neoclassical building, but whoops, there's nothing behind it. And then you got the real stuff, right? It's a little bit like your own little building that imitates the first house, of the founder, right? And you have this fake front on it. Well, that's the same thing, except this is in ginormous scale, right? So to call this a classical building is really weird because it was already deploying classicism as just a facade, and it had this new idea about how buildings are organized, which is through this corridor. And so that got me to thinking, well, I mean, I'm an historian. When was the first corridor? When, where can I find corridors like that, And I have to find them labeled. So I'm not interested in just looking at any old long piece of, space and saying, oh, that's a corridor. I want to find the label. So, like historians do, we hunt around and we find these things. So this is a palace built in Rome by this architect for Spanish ambassador. Spanish ambassador goes to Rome, he builds himself a palace, obviously. And lo and behold, in this palace, you see it says entrata, entrance, and then there's this word, corredor. And I go, well, that's sort of interesting. Why would the Spanish ambassador have a corredor in his building? Well, the Spanish Empire was a very peculiar empire. It had holdings in the Americas, as we know, but it had holdings all over Europe in funny places. And one of its geniuses was connecting those places by information. Sort of like if you have knowledge, you need to know where the boundaries are. You need to know where the military situations is. You have to have really up-to-date, the latest knowledge, right, to be successful as an empire and for military purposes. So they had these people, runners, who would go back and forth, and I'm just showing you some corredors. So the first corredors were not spaces, they were people. They were people who took information from the palace to the front lines, or from the front lines of a battle to some palace or something like that. They were couriers, runners, or the French would call them musketeers. And so I'm just showing you from the, from the film, The Musketeers. So these were men who basically had the dangerous job sometimes of going behind enemy lines or going through enemy territory with battle plans or with money or so forth like that. So these corredors, there's a more modern example of the corridor embodied by the FedEx man, who are modern day corredors, right? I can order something and then tomorrow it comes on my doorstep, right? And so it has become a type of modern capitalistic project. But initially it was a military project, right? To have these fast men doing these things. And so what we see here is this ambassador calling that piece of space a corredor when it's not particularly fancy space. It looks to me like a hallway, right? But he wants you, when you visit him, to know that at any moment a corredor could be coming in, right? So stand out of the way. This is a corredor could come in, right? And he's in his guard giardino back there, sipping his vino and talking to his friends, and there's the little corredor, right? So it was an insignia of power, like having internet connection, right? So that was, you say, when you come, who has the fastest internet, that's going to be the people who are going to be global victors, Well, who has the fastest corridors? So to label it wasn't just a functional question, it was a prestige question. He was sort of showing off that he's important enough to have a corridor come right to him, right? So pretty soon people caught on. And not people, but the elites caught on. And so if you were an elite, a king or a prince or something, you wanted a building with a corredor, because that meant these guys were coming. And so we see the slow emergence of various types of corredors being developed based on this sort of Spanish model. So here we are, Vasari's corridor, and basically Vasari, go to Florence, which all of you have, some of you might have done, but some of you hopefully will do, and you'll want to visit this corridor. So this corridor zigzags all the way through the city, and it goes from the Uffizi, which is the offices, and it goes all the way to the palace here, so that the Medicis could go from their house to this without ever going outside, right? There's an indoor relationship. So you could sort of sneak in and out and be invisible in this sort of corridor. So the corridor was a place where these, the powerful people could, get from their work to their residence without anybody seeing them, right? So it's like a highway, except when I go to my highway, I have to get in a car, and everyone, we're on the public transportation. There's a sort of a private transportation route across the town. But this idea of speed and efficiency and effectiveness, right? So here is still with us. So here I just happen to be at the Irish Parliament in Dublin, and who should show up but the corridors, right? Delivering packages, right? So this sort of model of speed and deliverance is become something that was important for the Spanish ambassador. Now we can compare that with Palladio. So most architectural students will hopefully, or at least have had some classes where they'll know Palladio is an Italian architect, very famous. And Italian, and Palladio will have your portico, and they'll have this space, and it's an andito. And andito comes from to walk, andare. And so in Palladio, you walk into the building. Buongiorno, come sta? Ah, va bene, so forth and so on, right? You put up down your coat, you hang your coat, you want some vino, maybe some aperitivo, and so forth. Not this guy. This guy, you open up the door, the guy's running in, Signora, Signora, you run in to this building. So it's a completely different sort of attitude about how you sort of enter a building. You can You can walk in the Palladian sense, or you can run in the Spanish imperial sense. So all of a sudden, you can begin to see there's a change of attitude about not just entering the building, but not just about this little piece of space here that is completely insignificant spatially, but has a powerful message to your friends, to your clients, and so forth. So it changes from a purely military point, like a Vasari's corridor, which is just military because the guy doesn't want to be seen out in the public. He might get shot or killed or something. So to actually something that you want to show off. You want to show off that you have corridors in your palazzo. So people, got it caught on. So this is Mr. Bernardino Spada. Spada, he was the second in command in the papacy under Pope Urban VIII. And he bought himself a palazzo. Not a particularly fancy palazzo. It was a fixer-upper, as we would say, in the real estate market. An old medieval palazzo. And he fixed it up. So he put in a new fancy facade. But then he said, oh my God, I've got to have a corridor, right? I got to show people that I'm powerful. So he got Borromini to design for him a corridor. So this is his view from his study. He's sitting at his desk, looking at his corridor. The funny thing is, there was not enough room in the building to have a long corridor. Right? So Borromini, in his infinite wisdom and genius, tricks you into thinking that it's a long room. It's actually foreshortened. And you can sort of see perspectively foreshortened. And here's the view where the right map is of his office down the corridor. And so there's no people coming and going. This is the view, of it. And you can see right what happens if you actually go into the back, right? Because it's foreshortened, and you actually look like you're 10 feet, 20 feet tall or something like that, right? So it's completely not meant to be used. It's meant to be just visual aid to the fact that you need to have a corridor since you're the second most powerful person in the Italian papacy. So in other words, it gets to my point that some of these early corridors were real, but some of them were not, right? Some were just sort of show-off pieces to have, in some sense, the sense that you were a powerful person. Now, it sort of begins to be even more interesting when the word corridor begins to be actually used in a functional way by the Jesuits. So the Jesuits come along, they see themselves as the saviors of the Catholic Church, and they see themselves as quasi-military environment, right? So they say, oh, you know, and they also want to be connected, right? They're not just going off into the hills somewhere and meditating quietly or calmly, right? They want to be connected in this global world. And so we talk often about the church, the Jesu, and the churches that get made, but we don't really often look at the rest of the plan. So here we are in Rome, and we see the Jesu, and then there's this sort of stuff, right? And this is the offices and monasteries of the thing. And in the one in Rome, there's this Pozzo Corredor, which was a corridor that led to one of the rooms that was inhabited by one of the monks, and it was decorated, and you can sort of see it's been, you know, incredible. Somebody painted it, and it's, you know, it's a star element of the building is this corridor. So corridors become, in the Jesuit world, basically this insignia of their internal global, you know, connectivity. So here we see, this is Dubrovnik, a Jesuit church. We see the church, and then we see the institution, and we see here correttori, and I'm pointing once again to the fact that it's labeled, so I'm not making this up, right? You know, that they have these correttori that allow the person to the entrance. So here's the restricted entrance that the corridors would come to, right? They ring the bell, you know, and they'd be let in, and they could go right to the abbot's chambers and deliver the message. So you might look to, let's say, the untrained eye that, you know, this is all just like the same old stuff, right? So if we compare it to a medieval monastery, we have the church and we have the monastery, and it's got a courtyard and it's got all sorts of things that might look like corridors, but they're not corridors, right? So the Jesuits basically deployed the corridor in their buildings specifically to outline this sort of military jargon and sort of the expeditiousness of information. Now, you don't have to go very far to prove this. We were just last night at the Jesuit church here in Quito, and we were wandering around, and here's, I assume all of you have been inside it, and you go to this little desk here, and you can see there's a plan. So we went to the plan, and we looked, as like any good architect would, oh, there's a plan, and we looked at the plan and go, oh, that's really cool, and oh, look, corredor. Now you could say, okay, that was built, printed, 10 years ago or something like that, right? How do we know that back in the 16th, 17th century, it was a corridor, right? Well, I don't know, of course, but my guess is it was a corridor because all the Jesuit institutions that had these things, and the fact that it has survived all of these centuries and still labeled a corredor sort of must mean something. So we get, in some sense, to we have the Spanish Empire word, and then we have the morphing of this concept into an actual building, right? And that sort of becomes sort of architectural and spatial. Then an interesting bit happens, which is that the Spanish Empire sort of loses, right? They have all these battles, it goes on, and big battles, and here battles, and fights, and but eventually, the English win. And one of the places they win is a called Battle of Blenheim. Battle is a ginormous battle. Everybody was part of this battle. And it was really ugly and brutal, and tens of thousands of men died, and no one could predict the outcome. But in the bloody end, the English won. And when they won it all. The slave trade, the spice trade, the pepper trade, the gold trade. It was a win and take all situation. And the Spaniards, sorry, they sort of lost out. So they built to celebrate this great victory. Now the English at that time were not an empire. They were just a bunch of pirate marauders in the in the ocean. They sort of lucked out, and they were land fighters. They didn't have much of a navy, in fact. And all of a sudden they said, "Oh my God, we have to protect our navy. We have to have navy. We have to protect the shipping. We have to have ship to here, and we have to go ships to there." So all of a sudden they became, like overnight, this empire. And they looked around. Okay, what are we going to do architecturally? They built the Palace of Blenheim. 1705, a complete monstrosity, Baroque architecture. If you go into architectural history, you see it as Baroque architecture. But, oh my God, there in the plan it says corredor. They're learning something from the Spaniards. They learned that if you want to be an empire, you have to walk and act and design like an empire. It means your buildings have to have this special gizmo inside it called a corredor. So it's like one of the earliest attempts to sort of steal the mana from the Spanish. Now, the English had always liked the Spanish. They always had a little bit of a fixation about Spanish culture and this and that. But now that they were on top of the heap, they were actually had to sort of borrow this word. So here's Castle Howard, by John Vanbrugh, and he sort of makes another of these buildings, and he's labeled it there. You sort of see the corredors, and the wife of the owner basically wrote him a letter and say, "I'm looking at your plan, it's really lovely. There's this weird word in there called corredor. Could you please explain to me what that is?" And he writes back and says, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's something from the Spanish. It's fine." You know. But basically what we see is the English trying to try on the corredor for size, right? And put it into their buildings. And they were not really, this is not really how they designed buildings because, most buildings just weren't big enough at the time, right? So here we see in the Dublin, there we have the prison and the castle, and so they add a new element here, and they have here, it's called a state corridor. So all of a sudden it becomes part and parcel of the state, right? The corridor is not just a space for fast-fleeted young men with swords and, it was for the state. It was where you had sort of dignified walking, but imaginary running relationships, right? So what we get is a sort of a shiftingness here about where the corridor is located. First, it was literally young men running around. Then it went into, obviously, sort of the military jargon. You wanted to have this corridor because it showed that you were connected militarily, right? And then the Jesuits, which is sort of military, in quotation marks, right? And then, of course, when it gets to English, it is military, but it's empire, but it also gets put into a different world, which is the world of, let's say, government and governmentality. So, so that we can sort of see. Now, the French never really warmed up to the corridor. And the French had these things called the enfilade. So if you wanted to go through a palace, you basically made rooms, and then you cut out a tunnel of doors, and you went from room to room to room to room. There's no walls, right? There's no corridor, right? So this enfilade system was very important in French palace architecture, and as a result, they never really adopted the corridor. So here we have by Ledoux, a beautiful building that he projected, and we can see there's rooms here, a room there, and a room here, and a room there, a room everywhere. No corridors, right? No corridors. And in that sense, it's very much Palladian, right? So it's coming out of that Palladio tradition that you connect room to room. You don't have running places, right? Okay. So Ledoux was anti-Corridic. He didn't want these funny corridor things, right? Right. He was very much in that idea that palaces are room to room, slow and dignified, andito, don't run in the hallway type thing. So I'm just putting here Palladio just that you can sort of see that basically Ledoux is just a bigger and better Palladio when it comes to planning the spaces of his building, right? And we'll sort of see the problem that encounters later on. So the French have different words for long, thin spaces. There's gallery. Now a gallery is usually a wall. It comes from ships. There's a wall, there's windows, and then there's a garden, right? So a gallery is usually one-sided. The gallery is not two walls, right? There's colonnade, which are columns going down, right? So there's no walls in a colonnade. An arcade, which is a sort of a shorter colonnade. A colonnade couvert, which is a cover, especially type of covered things. A dégagement, which is a type of loggia. And a couloir, which basically is a drain. It's like very, the drainage alley, right? So they never adopted corredor, a Spanish word, into the French architectural vocabulary. Whereas what I'm saying is that the English did. And that difference is like a little bit important in how the conversation develops. But the English were not exactly bowled over by the corridors either, because they too just also fell in love with Palladio. So it was Palladio this and Palladio that. And so when they made their palaces, they really sort of were, trying to do Palladio. And you couldn't do Palladio and have corridors. So here is the Holcombe Hall, 1761, seen as really this great English building. This is sort of Palladianism has arrived. English are now sophisticated, right? Because the English were like country bumpkins before. Now they're borrowing from Palladio. They are, trying to be civilized, right? And so you be civilized and you do Palladio because that was, what civilized cultures, liked. So what we see here is, a lot of Palladio, room and room and room and room, and that's all fine. So the elites were ambivalent about this introduction of the corridor, right? They didn't really want it. And so here we have another example. Carlton House, very famous, 1780s. It has this beautiful colonnade in front, so this classical Romany thing in front, and a very elegant, constrained facade. And then you look at the building went through several phases, so it's a little tricky. But basically, if you see how it's laid out, you see there's a grand sort of central, axis of stuff. But basically, it's sort of Palladio, but you cut the Palladio and then you unfold it. So it's sort of unfolded Palladio, and it's strung around, and everything in gray is service. So that's where their servants would be, and the cooks and the people you don't want to know about, right? So they would be in gray, right? And so therefore it was this ingenious system where you have a lot of outdoor volume where you could look at the gardens and this and that, and then the inside is basically used for the cooking and the servants and the laundry and that type of stuff. Now this is the US Congress building from about 1800, and you can see beautiful building. It's got the 2 Congress rooms, and there's no corridors, right? So the idea of corridors was still make people a little bit too nervous, right? It's basically still Palladio, right? And if you wanted to get from the House to the Senate, or from the Senate to the House, you had to go through this sort of avocado room. I don't know, it looked like an avocado to me, And it's because, they didn't want to make a hallway, so they made this sort of weird avocado thing. And so the English in the early 19th century began to sort of think of the corridor as a bad place. And if you read English romantic literature, that's where people get murdered. That's where bad things happen. Marquis de Sade, okay, he's French, but that's where people did terrible things in Marquis de Sade. It's like in the corridors. So the corridors began to sort of develop this bad reputation. And so what we see is, in some sense, that the idea of this sort of military Jesuit space based on the latest of the latest, right, technology comes to England, and it's like, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, we got some buildings that are called corridors, but basically we're a little nervous about it because it sort of goes against this French versus the Spanish problem here, you know. So the corridors sort of go dark in a way in the planning of buildings, but they pop out in a new building that was being developed, which is the barracks. Now, military barracks, we might think, okay, there've been military since ever and ever, right? But the idea of barracks is something that emerges in the 1700s and 1800s with the emergence of sort of early states and the attempt to sort of control and define sort of the military as a separate institution as opposed to just some farmers that you know, who give a stick to and say, okay, go and try to kill someone. You know. So in the late 1800s into the 19th century, the military became institutionalized in various places, France in particular after the revolution. And so we see these barracks and the training of men to stand in line, march, right, left, whatever we got to do, you know. So the training of, these aren't corridors anymore, these aren't people who are running, these are people who are marching, but marching in line. And so what we see in France and in England is the emergence of the corridor as in the barracks. So here's a barracks, and basically this is for the horse rider elements. And you know, there's the corridors, and there's where they would sleep, and their servants would stay here, and the horsemen would stay inside. So the corridor became a way in which you could begin to see this relationship between getting men to move simultaneously and act in a particular way, and the Corridic imaginary. So this is like an earlier corridor, an earlier barrack, and you can sort of see it's just a set of rooms with a colonnade in front of it. There's no corridor here yet, right? So my point is that the corridors become now an element of the barrack cultures. And so, you know, making men sort of do this makes a lot of sense if, you know, you have a corridor where that sort of is replicated. Now the whole thing begins to sort of shift very dramatically when we get to the Palace of Westminster. That was begun in 1840 by Barry and Pugin, you know, the beautiful building in London. And if you look at the plan of it, a little chaotic, and you go, oh my God, you know, how do you sort of read that? But if you go closer in, and you go, you know, closer in, you see, whoops, let me go back in here, you know, all sorts of corridors. This is like, the interior of this building is nothing but corridors, labeled, right? And very important that they are labeled as such, right? So we have the East Corridor, we have the West Corridor, we have the Peers Corridor, in other words, corridors for different types of people. We have the Lords Corridor, we have the Lawyers Corridor, we have corridors for the peers and private corridor, we have the Chancellor's Corridor. All of these corridors, when they intersected, would have had a person standing there to make sure that you didn't accidentally go from the Chancellor's corridors into the Peers corridors. No, that corridor is for this group of people, this corridor is for this group of people, this corridor is for this group of people. It's incredibly complicated. Today, or listening, if you look at this as an American, or just we think of politics, it's hard to understand that we could get a building with, you know, these corridors that were for certain groups of people, but that were also exclusionary, right? So the corridors were no longer military per se, but they were part of the idea that government would now act in a type of military way where sort of regimentation of society gets imprinted onto the plan. So we see all sorts of different types of corridors which allow people to circulate through the building in their own class structure. So the corridor became a way in which class difference could be designed and enforced, but also a way in which communication could happen. So it was incredibly clever. And the most clever of all is the Royal Court of Justice. Here, in this building, you have the trial lawyers, you got the judges, you got the public, you got the criminal lawyers, the defense lawyers. They all had separate entrances. So there are like, 10 different entrances. One for the trial lawyers, and they get into their corridor. One for the judges, and they get into their corridor. One for the lawyers, and they get into their corridor, and so forth. And so it was basically a machine, like a Corridic machine, that got people in and out and through this building, right? So this building is sort of like, apart from the courts themselves, pure corridors. It's just corridors. And then there are some boxes, boom, 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 which are the courts. So it was, so what we're seeing is a development here of the corridor as a place to organize an increasingly complex society. So we don't no longer have just, good guys and bad guys, right? We've got lawyers, and we've got judges, and we've got the public, and we've got the victims, and we got to this, and they shouldn't talk to each other or could talk to each other in particular ways, right? So this building basically helps you navigate all of these complexities. So there's a special corridor for the judges, and a special corridor for the prisoners and the lawyers, special corridor for the public, and so forth. Unfortunately, they don't let you take photographs in there, so I took a photograph, and I'm still, my heart beats with the security guard. I had to tell him, no, that was just in my throat. So anyway, I don't have any views of, except that one slightly nervous view of the inside. And it had a lot to do with the reformation of the legal system that was taking place in England sort of at the time. Particularly, one of the things was like divorce. So it used to be in England, you get divorced, you have to go to the priest. And the priest would say, man, I don't know, you guys fine, So basically in the mid-19th century, you could get officially divorced by the government. So you could go to the government and get divorced. But that meant you need divorce lawyers that mean this, and mean that, and who wants to meet your divorced wife if you're not on the corridor or anything like that. So one of the reforms that took place was divorce law, and one of the reasons they built this building was to handle, all of a sudden, the thousands and thousands of cases of divorces that took place that were previously done by the church. And that brings us back to this building, which we looked at. I'm sorry, not this building, but this building, which we looked at before, the St. George's Hall, Concert Hall. And we can begin to now appreciate, right, its innovation. And it wasn't just how you circulated the building, it was the fact that in the basement, the corridor allowed the ventilation system. This was the first building with a building-wide ventilation system in the world. So it was extraordinarily complicated, and I'm not even going to begin to try to describe it. But it was hot water and valves and this and that went up into different rooms and vents and so forth and fans and all that type of stuff. So all of that could be put in these corridors, right? And so the corridor in the basement was, in some sense, another attribute of this modernity by sort of facilitating a type of large building requiring movement of air. People were concerned that have a large building, you're going to get sick, you're going to get pneumonia, it's not healthy, and so forth. So there's a lot of study about health, and people thought that having air movement in large buildings was important. But how do you do it? And in winter it's even worse because you have these coal stoves and there's this coal exhaust and the carbon monoxide everywhere. It's a miracle they survived the 19th century. So these studies were basically done by the architect, who then eventually actually went to the United States and continued his work there. So what we see is now Americans coming along and say, oh, the English have these corridors and they're really great. We want corridors now. So the Brumidi corridor was built in the Capitol building. So you can see the old Capitol building there. And then they said, we're gonna do bigger and better. So they rebuilt it. And this time they put a corridor racks smack dab in the middle of the building. And this is where you meet people. This is where you talk to people. This is where you negotiate. This is where you hang out, And so this corridor became sort of the locus of political conversation in the United States. And of course, soon other government buildings sort of followed suit. So you can go to almost any state house in the United States, and you can sort of see the display of these corridors as basically ways in which you moved about. And then we can sort of see 23. A gentleman takes off his hat and holds it in his hand when a lady enters the elevator, in which he's a passenger, but he puts it on again in the corridor. The public corridor is like a street, but an elevator is suggestive of a room. And a gentleman does not keep his hat on in the presence of ladies in a house. So there was a lot of discussion, like how do you behave in a corridor, right? It's sort of a public space in a building, right? It's not a private space anymore, and so therefore you have the right to not take your hat off, right, which you would do in an elevator. And then schools got built in Germany and in Switzerland and elsewhere, large schools built by the nation state, sort of the ETH in Germany, ETH in Zurich, TU Berlin, and so forth. These are huge, enormous buildings. And so they had corridors that were called the sort of akademische corridor, the academic corridor. And sort of we can sort of see when a visitor walked through the corridors of the universities in Zurich, he could at least from the speech that he hears not know in what country he is. Right? So this is basically a moment where the celebration of corridors and publicness and interactionality is brought to bear as the essential element of education. Here we are at MIT. At MIT, we have from 1913 a corridor called the Infinite Corridor. It really is pretty long. And so it's nicknamed the Infinite Corridor. And it's meant to be a place where that type of interaction was part of the program. And of course, we have it in schools, and in any number of other buildings in the late 19th century. So what we see in the late 19th century is where the corridor is not just one thing, and it becomes basically a place where a certain type of internal publicness is required, but also where the complicated colonial, governmental, institutional, mess of all of that mixture, right? Where the colonial project, of colonial enforcement, but institutionality and public institutionality, but also the rise of the upper middle class of lawyers, barristers, and all this stuff, and in connection with industrial capitalism. So the corridor is becomes the space par excellence of that type of historical moment. It drifts into the modern era, of course, in a very powerful way, and I can just only give very quick minor examples here, but this is Mies van der Rohe, who was, corridically friendly. So we see he makes a corridor. This is the Weissenhof Siedlung in 27, and he links, as you would, the corridor with the staircase. And he also links it with the bathroom and with the kitchen. Because things are in vertical, right? You're going up and down. Humans go up and down. Water and electricity and shit goes up and down, So let's all put that all together in one package, right? And then everything else is just living. So that makes a lot of sense to do that. Well, right down the road, Corbusier was making his building, and this is his famous example of his building, all very modern, and people call it modern architecture. Who wouldn't say that Corbusier is not modern architecture? But Corbusier, being French, separated the movement through the building from the logistics of modernity, the water, the sewage, and so forth. Right? He didn't put those two things together that you would normally do if you have a corridor in mind. So how does this building operate? Here's the plan of it. And you can see on this wall here, he lined up all the things that were wet. Right, so we have here the toilet, then we have the kitchen, and then we have the bath and the bidet. Right? So in a very French way, the bidet looks all the way down enfilade the entire facade. Just love that. No? Did I get that? Everybody know what a bidet is? Okay. All right. So we can think of it this way, that the bidet, the kitchen, bath, that's all along that wall. That means that wall has pipes in it. Those pipes got to go somewhere, and no one's going to tell you this except me, but they go here. You can see here, this is this bump out, not a column. This is a structural wall. This is not a column. It's a fake colonnette, right, in which are the pipes. Right. because he's got to get the pipes down, right? Now, Mies van der didn't have the problem because he just put them in the wall where he had the staircase. Pretty easy, right? But he's separating the two out, and so therefore you have this problem that the pipe's got to like, he didn't want to like put the sewage pipe right, just hanging it down right out of the building. So corridors began to sort of be now, apart from Corbusier, deployed, however, in sort of the easy street architecture of office buildings and apartment buildings and so forth. And of course, that didn't really often sit very well. And over time, corridors by the 70s were seen as something really quite bad. So a very famous book is called Oscar Newman, probably not your generation, but my generation, all read this. We're going, oh my God, and he's talking about corridors, lobbies, elevators, stairs are dangerous places to walk. They can cover with graffiti, littered with garbage and waste. Long, narrow corridors, secluded stairwells are to be shunned since they elevate the level of crime, drug use, vandalism, and rape. And you go, okay, I'm not going to do corridors. And so corridors really got into really the bad place. And then even, this is 2009, environmental studies prove that corridors are isolating and stressful and that students who lived in corridor buildings tended to withdraw socially and frequent mental health clinics. Well, there are not a lot of corridors in this campus, I was pleased to note, so you're safe. So corridors became, everywhere we had corridors, it was like, okay, let's get rid of those buildings. So this is what happens to the hospitals and the corridors. Everything got decommissioned, and they wind up looking like this. But then the question was like, what do you do if you don't have corridors? So what we see in the 70s is an incredible experimentation. So this is a building that none of you have ever heard of. No one is not on any textbook, but this is the Osram offices, built in 1963, and it was really the first non-Corridic office building in history. No one's ever talked about it. And you can see what the architects did. They jammed everything that needed room into one corner, one edge, and then they just said, whoo, whatever you want, go at it. You want to move here? You want to sit there? No, don't worry, don't worry. If someone's overhearing, there's a tough luck, no privacy. You can see a little bit, it's a big building, right? But you can sort of see on this side is where you put all the necessary rooms where you want some privacy. And this side, it was just this sort of free-for-all, And people loved it. So high schools began to adopt the idea that corridors were too constraining, too dangerous. So we want high schools where people can free flow ideas and exchange ideas and so on. So this is a school from 1970, and they did the same thing. They, instead of putting it on this edge, they put the bathrooms and some student meetings, in the center there, and then everything else was just furniture, space and furniture, right? Yeehaw! Well, it turned out by the time we get to the mid-'80s, this was a disaster, right? This is not how anybody builds schools anymore today. It turns out, people want constrained rooms and people like that, right? Because how are you going to teach with, a third graders here and fourth graders here, and then you want to show a map of something, or you want to do a science experiment, and people are wandering around. I mean, it just mess, right? But there was so much anxiety about corridors that people thought this was, really, really good, right? So here's another slightly better, but nonetheless typical high school. I can't remember where this is. Come to me in Raleigh, I think. And you can sort of see, right, no corridors, right? It's sort of Palladio with a courtyard, right, in a way, right? So you go sort of from room to room and place to place and so forth like that. And then, to make things even more profound, this guy called Robin Evans, very famous architectural historian, people know him on the architectural history side, he wrote an article called Doors and Passages in 1978. And in this article, he says, I'm going to tell you about corridors. And he says, corridors were invented by the Protestants because of their work ethic. And they're narrow and constraining, and we don't want to live in this sort of narrow little Protestant world. We want to have the grandezza of life. We want to feel that we can have the beauty. I mean, just imagine, he argues, that the Virgin Mary, gave birth in a corridor. I mean, it's like, it boggles the mind, right? So he basically looked at the Italians and said the Italians didn't have corridors, and look, they had this wonderful culture. We have corridors, and look at our culture. That it was invented by the Protestants is 100% bullshit. I mean, there's absolutely no truth to that at all, but everyone believed him because he's an historian, right? And so it's like, oh my God, the historian says it was invented by the Protestants, and that really can't be good, and so we want to go back to Palladio. And so, okay, let's, this is Facebook, I think. I can't remember there. Facebook and Google have these big play zones where you can innovate and play at the same time. But perhaps one of the greatest examples, of course, is the Scottish Parliament building, 1999. It's like an incredible building. I have not visited it yet. But, it's like, whew, okay, I got it, no corridors. But how do you make a building like, that's not like the Parliament building in London, right? Which is all corridors. This is Scotland. They go, we don't want that. That's all corridors. We want a building that's no corridors, right? Completely anti-English, right? So, I mean, I don't even know where you go to the bathroom in here, but there, I'm sure in some edge corner, some fin or somewhere, there's some bathrooms. So Jean Nouvel, of course, being already French and being trained as, is in an anti-Corridic way, this is the Akbar, the tower. So what he does is he, packages all the things that like the bathroom and the staircase, and you put that in a big core, and then he basically takes these brooms that you then need and sort of puts them there. So it's basically Palladio, once again, like snipped and unfolded, carefully like unwrapped, right? And so it's sort of like a weird decollaged Palladio, right? And then all the stuff that Palladio didn't think about or know about in those days, right? Just jammed in the core, right? So it's not, not too bad. Rem Koolhaas, of course, doesn't like corridors too much either, right? So this is the Casa de Musica. In the center is the hall. And you can sort of, he's really trying hard, to not have any corridors, right? So he's struggling a little bit here, right? That's like, oops, it's a dark corridor. Fortunately, it probably goes to the bathrooms, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, but he's really struggling to make spaces without doing any corridors. And it reminds me of the same Baroque problem, right? This is a palace in Turin where they're trying to sort of get you through the building without a corridor, right? It's like really hard, right, to do that. So you have these weird knots in the building where they're trying to like get you in and around. Frank Gehry, of course, is the great exponent of the anti-Corridic movement. This is in Sydney building, and this is, pretty clear what he's doing. He's putting all the bathrooms and the circulation and the kitchens and all that in the center, right? It's like an invert of a courtyard, right? And then in that sort of Palladianesque way, right? Putting all the program, unfolding it around, right? Into the perimeter, right? So it's basically sort of still let him say return to sort of play. And of course, my favorite building where I park in the garage below every day looks a little bit like someone threw up, on the campus. And on the inside, it does look like someone threw up. And just try to find a bathroom in there. I tell you, like no, because there are no corridors, and the corridors aren't linked to the bathrooms. That wouldn't be fair. But it's beautiful, and I do love the building. And his attempt to sort of not be Corridic, right, shows that there's a sort of flow here, you flow there, there's something here, there's some leaning column of something there, some leaning column that way. There, you see where the man is there's a leak, because the whole building leaks. So don't go there in the winter and rainstorm. It's like walking into an aquatic symphony. That type of stuff, all over the place. All right. So I want to summarize a little bit. The corridor is this sort of incredible moving thing. It's not a single structure. It's not it has one word, corridor, but what I've been trying to show is that it starts as an addendum to a palace. then it goes into the body of the building with the Jesuits, right? And then the English sort of adopted it, but ultimately they sort of reject it. And then it goes to prisons, or it goes to barracks, right? It goes back into the military world, you know, until we get into the 19th century. And then the English just can't get enough of these corridors, right? And the corridors are basically this signage of professionalism, of bureaucracy, of coloniality, of imperial majesty, right? And the Americans sort of fall in line with that. And then when that sort of ends, then we have it living on in the sort of the modern office building and hotels and things like that. But the story then takes this turn when we see the emergence of the sort of the anti-Corridic movement, right? Architects trying desperately to not make corridors because corridors were seen as dangerous and dangerous places. And of course it forced them to invent, but in reality, in my view, it just brought them back to Palladio, right? It's, you know, so we sort of see how Palladianism didn't end when we sort of think it did, right? It sort of comes back now at the very moment when we think, you know, Palladian, we talk about Palladianism, we think 19th century, but really Palladianism as a planning, how do you plan spaces, right? And there's something amazing about, I'm not against Palladio. I'm not saying Palladio was a bad architect or that is, but I'm trying to show the longevity of a certain way of thinking and the type of resistances that are in play that the corridor produces that is sort of instrumental to understanding the tensions of modernity. Modernity is not sort of there and it's all what we know, right? But modernity is in some sense built around tensions. And all of these tensions are important. And this is a tension that has to do with how you plan a building. What is the building in its internal organs, right? And so we see these two models basically being played out over time. Thank you very much. I have an office at MIT on the Infinite Corridor. And the president one day said, oh, listen, we have a newspaper for the university, and could you give us something, history about the Infinite Corridor? And so I said, well, not a problem. Okay, I'll do that. 8 years later, I published this article. Because when I first said is it the Infinite Corridor, I thought it was like funny, the Infinite Corridor, haha, what's the big deal? I didn't know it had any history at all. But being the historian, I just sort of stuck with it. And then I, discovered all this stuff. And so 8 years later, I gave them, what they wanted was a paragraph, for the news bulletin, And I gave them, a 30-page manuscript. And they're going like, what? And I said, it's pretty cool. So now every now and then the president's office, someone says, tell me something about the corridor. And they said, oh, go to Mark. So it started completely accidentally. I had absolutely no interest in this topic at all, based on anything except, and had they not asked me to write a little blurb for the local newspaper or something, I wouldn't have done it. So it just came to show, this gets to the question of like, how do you start a research project? And sometimes it just like literally falls into your lap like that and you're lucky. All I could say.
Anyone else?
Good night. Do you think that it's really a need to have a corridor? Like sticking with the topic of the privacy and all of these things, but thinking like the corridor could be a public space, like a common space when you go through this transition. Do you think that right now it's like a must in like, I think in the public places like universities, colleges, or things like that.
Christian and I were just talking about that, and it depends a little bit whether you catch me in the morning, noon, or night on this topic, I guess. There's something about the 19th century corridors, which were a public space inside a building. Today, when we think of public space, it's always outdoors, right? It's always a piazza or a plaza, or maybe a courtyard. But we don't think of a building possessing a fantastic public space, right, anymore. You know, modernity has sort of erased that. And it's sort of a little sad that we don't have that. And I think we've sort of drifted towards a world of informality where we're nervous about being too, I put my tie on because I'm giving a public talk, But the idea of, being presentable in public inside of a building, right? Whereas today we sort of love and we sort of relax in a building, right? They're much more informal, right? Informality has basically, maybe you could say almost gone too much in a way, right? So, in Germany, my architectural education in Switzerland was in Semper's building, which was a big corridor, right? And the faculty would talk to students in their last name. No one addressed anybody in their first name, And it was like only when I came to America and someone said, "Hey, Mark, how you doing?" And I'm going, "Oh, you mean me?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know," And I was very uncomfortable talking to my professors in first name, but that's the way you do it, right? So, I don't know if there's quite a connection between, these types of ways to think about it. Clearly, I'm not trying to say we should go back to the corridors of the 19th century. But I do think that we have done a lot of great experimentation in anti-Corridic architecture, whether we like it or not, Frank Gehry or Rem or these people, But maybe we're leaving a little bit something out, right? Which is, what would a public space be like on the inside, which isn't an auditorium, which is by definition public, So I don't really have the question. I hope architects can maybe come up with some interesting ideas.
I think you just answered my question, which is, what do you think we will
So the word corridor is expanded. We have urban corridors, we have railroad corridors, we have pipeline corridors. We use the word quite freely to talk about these sort of assemblages of realities over long stretches of territory, right? So it has leaked into these sort of territorial ideas rather than sort of some spatial ideas. And so for better or worse, you can say, right? So it become a metaphor rather than a spatial problem or spatial practice, contested spatial practice, right? So I don't know. What I'm trying to get us to understand here is that the corridor, was a weird thing to begin with, right? And it remained weird throughout its entire history. And it was never settled, right? In the late 19th century, it sort of became settled when the government said, we're making a state house and it has to have a corridor. And we know it became governmentality. And then it sort of got ruined when it, went into hospitals and hotels and, things like that, So we're sort of like in that gap. How do we sort of remind ourselves that being in a public persona in a building might have some value, right, if the architecture lived up to it? It's, these corridors in the late 19th century, they had frescoes and statues and fancy marble floors and things like that. All the things we don't do anymore today. So it's impossible for most architects to even make a corridor. It's like so expensive, part of it. I don't know. I'm just throwing this out as a problem.
Any other questions?
But what I really, really like is the running part. When I was in high school, I always got called out by the principal for running in the corridors, at least once a time a week. And one day I turned a corner, and I ran into my French teacher, and we fell on the floor in a big heap of arms and legs and all that type of stuff. And that was really bad. I got detention and all that type of stuff. And so there's something that I'm really trying to return to, the running part, because we're not allowed to run in buildings, but the corridor was allowed you to run, and so maybe that's a point, I don't know.
Well, thank you for the lecture. I have a
And that is something that I also find incredible, right? You sort of think of buildings like in a time accordion, where you're taking the building, you're shrinking it in a way, right, to make it the corridor work, Whereas Palladio is the opposite. He wants the accordion to get bigger and bigger in a way, right, so that you can't run anywhere. I don't know if that helps, but it's a good question. Yeah.
Hi, I have a little bit more than a question.
Square room, and then there's a long room, and then there's some rooms with have just one floor, and some have then balconies where you can look down. And then you go through all of this, and then you turn right and you enter the large courtyard. It is like one of the most amazing spatial sequences in the world, And that is sort of, I would say, a way to rethink the corridor, right? Where we think of as spatial sequences, where perhaps there are ancillary views into it, So we can sort of think, well, every shopping mall sort of will do that. You have now upper stairs, right? But that's not the same thing, right? So it definitely going through, definitely connecting. There definitely need to be rooms, so to speak, right? But it could be that we deal with spatial sequencing, that it's not just the long, infinite thing anymore, which we're sort of scared of, but we can design it in a way that sort of still spatially sequenced, but not Palladian, right? It still feels like you might want to run, even though you might not, as opposed to the andito or the beautiful walking. I mean, the 19th century things were clearly not meant to be runners anymore. These were bureaucrats and lawyers that are running, But it's still that memory of that was still there. Is that helping a little bit? Okay.
Perhaps a final question? No? We have some drinks and food.
Thank you. Whew, I'm sweating.